Hey there, welcome to a story of chaos, betrayal, and war's brutal finality. Today we delve into a devastating naval massacre that took place in the Bismarck Sea on the 3rd of March, 1943, an event that shattered the illusions of Japanese soldiers and changed the course of the Pacific War forever. Have you ever wondered what it looks like when a mighty fleet is torn apart in seconds? How a single attack can turn a proud convoy into a burning graveyard? What secrets did intercepted messages reveal about the Japanese plans before disaster struck? Could the innovative tactics of Allied bombers have been predicted, or was this destruction an unavoidable nightmare? And what was the true cost paid by the 6,900 Japanese soldiers? Soldiers who believed in honor and victory, but found only ruin. All these questions swirl around one haunting event, an ambush at sea that left wreckage strewn across the water, oil slicks like scars on the ocean's surface, and thousands of men desperately clinging to fragments of their shattered fleet. But what was the real story behind this disaster? Was it mere coincidence, or a carefully calculated Allied strike based on intercepted intelligence and revolutionary bombing techniques? How did the use of skip bombing and heavily armed B-25s, pioneered by the Americans, turn the tide of this brutal encounter? This is more than a story of ships sinking and lives lost. It's a puzzle of secrets, strategy, and survival. One that asks if the Japanese convoy's downfall was inevitable, or if the war's turning point was already written in the skies above. And now the most critical question: what truly happened during those dark hours in the Bismarck Sea, and how did a handful of Allied aircraft bring a fleet of nearly 30 ships to total devastation? Stay with us, because in this video, we'll trace every step of the journey, separating fact from fiction, uncovering hidden truths, and revealing the shocking events that changed the course of Pacific history forever. The story begins now. On the early morning of March the 3rd in the year 1943, precisely at 10:15 hours, a haunting scene unfolded in the midst of the Bismarck Sea, approximately 30 nautical miles northwest of the small island of Lille, situated near New Guinea. A Japanese naval officer, his hands smeared and darkened by thick, sticky oil, trembled uncontrollably as he clutched the fragmented remnants of what was once an integral part of the bridge structure of the destroyer Horatio. His uniform, soaked through with fuel oil and salt water, bore the stains of the brutal scene around him. These images, the sights, sounds, and smells, would embed themselves into his memory, haunting him for the rest of his days. Through eyes blurred and burned by salt and smoke, he observed the wreckage. Aircraft and ships reduced to burning debris stretched across the vast expanse of the sea, some of it smoldering with flames that cast flickering shadows over the chaos. Oil slicks spread like dark scars across the water's surface, mixing with the remnants of destroyed vessels, while thousands of men clung desperately to fragments of wreckage, grasping at life amid the wreckage that had once been their convoy's proud fleet. The convoy, which had departed from Rabaul with ample confidence just 2 days earlier, was now reduced to a scattered, shattered mass, a forsaken tableau of war's destruction. The survivors, battered and desperate, would soon learn that their nightmare was far from over, and that the worst was yet to come. In total, about 6,900 soldiers from the Imperial Japanese Army's 50th 1st Division had embarked on this perilous voyage. They had boarded 8 transport ships at Simpson Harbor in Rabaul on February the 28th, believing that their mission would reinforce the strategic position at Leh and potentially turn back the tide of the ongoing campaign in New Guinea. Instead, what greeted them was a brutal reality that utterly shattered their expectations about warfare, honor, and the conduct of their enemies. The encounter they faced defied every lesson they had been taught, every belief in the honor code that Japanese military doctrine emphasized, and every assumption about how the United States would behave in battle. Assumptions propagated by Japanese propaganda to foster confidence, but now brutally disproven. The planning of this ill-fated operation had begun months earlier, in late December of 1942, within the strategic confines of the Imperial General Headquarters located in Tokyo. Lieutenant General Hoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army stationed at Rabaul, found himself increasingly pressed by the deteriorating situation in New Guinea. The Japanese leadership, recognizing the need to strengthen their foothold in the Southwest Pacific, authorized the dispatch of a convoy, a decision driven by strategic necessity. This convoy was to consist of 8 destroyers tasked with escorting 8 transport ships carrying the primary force of the elite 51st Division, troops transferred from China in hopes of reinforcing their position at Leh and turning the tide of the fierce battles engulfing the region. On the marked day, February the 28th, 1943, the convoy composed of these 8 destroyers and 8 transport ships set sail from Simpson Harbor in Rabaul under the protection of nearly 100 fighter aircraft. The flagship of the convoy, the destroyer Shirayuki, flew the command pennant of Rear Admiral Masatami Kimura, a seasoned officer with extensive experience leading successful convoy operations. Kimura, acutely aware of the dangers, understood that the mission was perilous. His readiness was based on war games and intelligence estimates, which predicted that roughly 4 out of every 10 transport ships could be lost, along with between 30 and 40 aircraft. These projections gave the operation only a 50-50 chance of reaching its destination intact. By March 1, 1943, as the convoy navigated around the northern coast of New Britain, it encountered a new threat. An American reconnaissance aircraft, a B-24 Liberator, from the 91st Bombardment Group, appeared on the scene. What the Japanese forces were unaware of was that their movements had already been anticipated by their adversaries. Allied intelligence, having intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications in Melbourne, FRU Mel, and Washington, D.C., had successfully translated messages revealing the convoy's planned route and intended arrival time. The alarm bells had sounded long before the convoy reached its destination. Meanwhile, at 5th Air Force Headquarters, General George Kenney received a crucial update, news that had been eagerly awaited by the Allied forces, and the information that promised a turning point in their ongoing campaign. For months, his experienced air crews had been honing a revolutionary combat technique known as skip bombing, a method involving low-altitude, precise, and highly effective attacks designed to maximize damage to Japanese ships while minimizing Allied aircraft exposure. This tactic, when perfected, held the potential to dramatically shift the balance of naval power in the Pacific theater, and now the moment had arrived to put it into action. The bombing techniques used during World War II were the result of independent innovations developed by several combatant nations, including Italy, Australia, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. One particularly effective method, known as skip bombing, revolutionized naval assault strategies. This technique permitted aircraft to deliver bombs by skimming the water's surface, causing the explosive devices to bounce across the water, much like pebbles skipped over a pond. When executed skillfully, this method dramatically increased the likelihood of hitting targets such as ships and transports, especially in conditions where traditional high-altitude bombing might be less accurate or feasible. In conjunction with this technique, the development of specially modified aircraft, particularly the B-25 Mitchell bombers, proved crucial. Major Paul Pappy Gunn was instrumental in these modifications, outfitting B-25s with as many as 8 forward-facing, 50-caliber machine guns positioned in the nose of the aircraft. These heavily armed gunships combined the firepower of multiple machine guns with the innovative skip bombing tactics, turning them into formidable flying platforms capable of unleashing devastating volleys of bullets and bombs against enemy shipping at close ranges. Their combined firepower and precision significantly contributed to the destruction of Japanese maritime assets during operations in the Pacific. On the morning of March the 2nd, a day shrouded in dull gray mist and thick, overcast clouds, the scene was set for a significant naval encounter. By mid-morning, around 10 o'clock, the skies suddenly cleared as the clouds dispersed, revealing a formidable fleet of 29 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers ascending to high altitudes. These formidable aircraft, known for their durability and firepower, were soon to unleash a heavy assault on a Japanese convoy. When they struck, their attack resulted in the sinking of a large merchant vessel, the damage inflicted upon 2 others, and the igniting of a destroyer. The first victim of this aerial onslaught was the vessel named the Kyoko Maru, which was tasked with transporting 1,500 troops along with drums of aviation fuel, making its loss even more catastrophic. Pilots flying the B-17s later reported witnessing the catastrophic failure of the Kyoko Maru, which was seen breaking apart amid a fiery explosion that lit up the entire convoy. The massive transport, weighing over 5,493 tons, disintegrated in a blinding fireball visible from every ship in the vicinity. Immediately, the destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze, acting swiftly, moved toward the wreckage to rescue survivors. They heroically pulled oil-soaked men from the treacherous waters, risking themselves to save those in peril. However, such acts of humanity would soon prove tactically perilous, as the rescuers had to slow down their movements, leaving them vulnerable to enemy attack. By the dawn of March the 3rd, the weather had cleared, providing perfect conditions for aerial combat. The convoy, which had been reduced to merely 7 transports and 8 destroyers, had already traveled nearly 2/3 of its journey from Leh, when suddenly, at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, chaos erupted from multiple directions, bringing destruction. In that brief span of approximately 15 minutes, the entire Japanese plan unraveled catastrophically, marking what would be seen as the moment of Japan's defeat in World War II. Initially, high-altitude B-17s drew Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire skyward, distracting the enemy and opening the door for a subsequent assault. While everyone looked upwards, 13 Australian fighters, referred to as bow fighters, approached at mast height, their 8 forward-firing guns raking across the decks of the ships. Behind them, the modified B-25 Mitchell bombers approached at extremely low altitudes, with their prop wash visibly leaving streaks on the water surface as they skimmed toward their targets. The skip bombing technique, employed with deadly efficiency, proved to be remarkably effective during this engagement. These bombs, designed to skip over the water much like stones thrown across a pond, would bounce into the sides of the ships and detonate, or submerge and explode beside the hulls, causing maximum damage. Captain Ed Lana, leading the 90 Squadron's modified B-25s, approached the transport vessel Teomaru at wave level, his aircraft's forward guns silencing the ship's anti-aircraft defenses just before releasing their deadly payload. The bombs Lana's aircraft dropped skipped twice across the water's surface, before striking the hull of the Teomaru at its waterline, causing catastrophic damage. The 6,870-ton transport split apart within minutes, sinking into the sea beneath a growing cloud of smoke and debris. Within a quarter of an hour after the initial strikes, by 10:15 in the morning, all 7 transports had been hit. Some were already sinking, their structures overwhelmed by the force of the explosions. The damage extended beyond the transports, as 3 destroyer escorts had also sustained serious harm or had been sunk outright. One notable vessel, the destroyer Shira. The scene that unfolded in the aftermath of the sinking was harrowing and chaotic, with the waters around the sunken ships thick with the oil slick of bunker fuel and littered with debris, wreckage, and the bodies of thousands of men. The ocean was a grim tableau of tragedy, where the desperate efforts of those left alive played out amid the chaos. Among the scattered survivors were soldiers who could not swim, their hopes dashed by exhaustion or injury, clinging desperately to fragments of wreckage in an attempt to stay afloat. Others were wounded, their injuries compounded by the treacherous conditions, fighting their last battles against the relentless sea. Conservative estimates later suggested that more than 3,000 men had been cast into these waters, their lives hanging in the balance, with little hope for rescue. Amidst this overwhelming scene, the 4 destroyers that had survived, the Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami, and Shikinami, embarked on rescue missions, efforts driven by duty and urgency. These vessels managed to bring approximately 2,700 survivors back to the port of Rabaul, offering a fleeting glimmer of hope amid the despair. Yet their capacity was limited, and their rescue efforts were curtailed by the imminent return of Allied aircraft overhead, which signaled a new and more sinister phase of the operation. At precisely 1,400 hours on the 3rd of March, the skies above the wreckage darkened once again as American aircraft reappeared. But their mission now was not rescue. From the perspective of those stranded in the water, the arrival of the planes initially seemed a relief. Perhaps they were there merely to photograph the destruction or to assess the damage inflicted on the enemy's forces. Such a sense of cautious optimism quickly faded into dread. However, when the aircraft, now descending to wave height, began to unleash their fury. The pilots, adhering to a controversial and brutal policy, commenced strafing runs that targeted not only the wreckage and the surviving ships, but also the men struggling to survive in the water. This aggressive campaign involved B-25 Mitchell bombers, A-20 Havocs, and Beaufighters, which made repeated passes over the area, their machine guns ripping through the water and foam, turning it into a frothy, bloody mess. From the American military's perspective, these actions were justified as a necessary measure to prevent the enemy from reconstituting and reinforcing the Japanese garrison at Leh, a strategic point of interest. The rationale was that if the survivors in the water managed to reach the shore, they might bolster Japanese forces in the region, thus prolonging the conflict. Consequently, the strafing of Japanese survivors in the water was seen as a tactical necessity aimed at suppressing any potential threat. However, from the perspective of international principles of warfare and wartime morality, what was happening in those waters was acutely controversial. The orders from General Kenneth Kenny made it unequivocally clear: no Japanese soldier was to be allowed to reach New Guinea alive. This directive left no room for compassion or the sort of honorable conduct traditionally associated with warfare, particularly under the principles of Bushido, the code that emphasized dignity, respect, and fair treatment of defeated adversaries. The Japanese soldiers, and indeed many civilians, who found themselves in the water, experienced a series of brutal shocks that shattered their last illusions of an honorable conflict. Their suffering underscored the stark reality that this brutal campaign disregarded the ideals of dignity and humanity, reducing these men to targets to be eliminated by any means necessary. As darkness fell on the evening of March 3rd, the American Navy deployed a fleet of PT boats, the small but swift vessels of the United States Navy, to patrol the area. Under the command of Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, a force of about 10 PT boats assembled in the shadowy hours of the night to hunt down the remaining survivors and any vessels attempting to escape. The night's operations were relentless and systematic, with searchlights piercing the darkness and revealing the movements of drowning men and fragile boats struggling across the disturbed sea. The sound of machine guns and torpedoes echoed across the water as the PT boats swept through the debris-strewn ocean, searching for targets. During these nighttime raids, PT-43 and PT-150 discovered the battered transport ship Owawa Maru, which was still afloat but severely damaged. Without hesitation, they launched torpedoes against it, sinking the vessel and leaving more men to drown or struggle in the water. For the Japanese survivors, the night brought yet further horror. The blood in the water, now mixed with oil and debris, attracted sharks, predatory creatures driven by the scent of blood and the commotion above the water. As the distressed men struggled for life, some faced the terrifying reality of being attacked from below, their hopes of rescue cruelly snatched away by these relentless predators. When dawn finally broke on the 4th of March, the full extent of the catastrophe was laid bare. The debris field stretched across a vast area, approximately 40 miles, haunting the rapid and chaotic retreat of the Japanese forces left behind a trail of destruction and despair. As they hastily withdrew, they took with them a number of their soldiers who had been rescued from the sea, adding to the grim toll of the engagement. The American forces, on their part, justified the brutal strafing attacks on the retreating enemy by citing both immediate tactical needs and a sense of retribution for earlier atrocities. According to James Duffy's detailed account in his book, War at the End of the World, an incident vividly illustrating this brutal mindset involved a B-17 bomber, affectionately nicknamed the Double Trouble, which was under the command of Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore. During this episode, the aircraft inadvertently collided with a Japanese Zero fighter, causing a chaotic scene in the skies. Meanwhile, 7 members of the bomber crew had parachuted safely down into the sea. However, rather than being left in peace, these stranded soldiers helplessly drifted in the water while Japanese fighters descended upon them, gunning them down as they floated defenselessly. This horrifying spectacle was observed firsthand by crews of other American bombers flying in the vicinity, fueling their outrage and fury. The incident deeply enraged the American pilots, who viewed such actions as a clear violation of any remaining standards of conduct, and General Kenny later characterized these aggressive attacks as mopping up operations, implying a ruthless effort to eliminate all resistance, regardless of the circumstances. Over the following days, American and Australian airmen repeatedly returned to the scene of the fighting on a systematic and relentless patrol of the waters, actively searching for any remaining Japanese survivors. This campaign, driven by a brutal determination, often involves strafing Japanese lifeboats and makeshift rafts in the open sea. Kenny euphemistically referred to these violent missions as mopping up operations, but their true nature was far more visceral and merciless. A confidential report dated March 20th in the year of 1943 painted a grim picture of these operations, stating that the slaughter continued unabated until nightfall. It vividly described the deadly environment. Any survivors fortunate enough to evade immediate attack and slip away from the strafing aircraft were left in waters at least 30 miles from land, where the danger was compounded by the presence of man-eating sharks that lurked in the depths, ready to strike at any vulnerable victim. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines, specifically I-17 and I-26, attempted daring rescue missions amidst this chaos, carefully maneuvering to avoid the vigilant eyes of American aircraft overhead. On the 6th of March, these submarines managed to rescue a total of 170 survivors from the treacherous waters. 2 days later, the outbounding 26 submarine located another 54 men, whom it safely brought ashore at a location called Leh. Despite these efforts, the submarines could only carry limited numbers at a time, leaving hundreds of desperate men behind in the vast, unforgiving ocean. The crews of these submarines vividly recounted the horrific scenes they encountered aboard their vessels. Men calling out desperately from the darkness, oil-covered survivors so weak and fragile that they could barely climb aboard, and the agonizing dilemma faced by rescuers who had to decide who to save and who to leave behind. The grim statistics underscored the tragedy. Out of approximately 6,900 troops desperately needed in New Guinea, only around 1,200 managed to reach the safety of Leh. An additional 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and eventually returned to Rabaul. Tragically, around 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors had lost their lives in these events. Fortunately, American losses were minimal in comparison. Only 4 aircraft and 13 airmen were lost during the entire operation. This resulted in a staggering casualty ratio of 230 to 1, a figure considered to be unprecedented in the annals of naval warfare. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea thus proved to be a pivotal turning point in the Pacific theater. The severe losses inflicted upon the Japanese forces effectively deterred them from ever again risking the transportation of large convoys through waters under the control of American aircraft. Consequently, Japan would never again attempt to reinforce garrisons or supply islands by surface convoy routes within range of Allied aerial dominance. Following the conclusion of the war, Captain Tomichihara, who had commanded the destroyer Shigura and was not present during the battle, conducted interviews with survivors and authored what became the most renowned Japanese assessment of the event. He described the ordeal as never having experienced such a debacle, emphasizing how starkly it contrasted with Japan's earlier successful withdrawal operation from Guadalcanal. His interviews with those who had participated revealed a profound sense of psychological devastation. The defeat by the American forces in this engagement was almost beyond belief for the Japanese Navy. The battle also marked a significant evolution in aerial warfare, showcasing revolutionary techniques that the Japanese had not anticipated. The combination of skip bombing, an innovative tactic where bombs were released in a manner resembling, during World War II, the skies over the Southwest Pacific Theater became a battleground not only of aircraft and weaponry, but also of innovation and fierce combat tactics. Among the notable military figures was Major William Benn of the 63rd Squadron, part of the 43rd Bomb Group, Heavy, operating under the 5th Air Force of the United States Army Air Forces. His profound expertise and leadership in aerial logistics and transportation played a vital role in maintaining the crucial supply chains across this turbulent region. Major Benn's strategic use of aircraft and military transports helped sustain Allied operations amidst the chaos of war, ensuring that men and material moved efficiently through the challenging terrains and hostile environments characteristic of the operational theaters during the conflict. Alongside the evolving technological landscape, inventive modifications of aircraft emerged as a defining feature of the air war. One of the most revolutionary innovations was introduced by Major Paul Pape guns, whose remarkable modifications transformed conventional bombers into formidable flying warships. Major Guns, serving with the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bomb Group, devised a specialized strafer version of the A-20 and B-25 aircraft. These modified planes were outfitted with an extensive array of from 8 to 14 forward-firing caliber 50 machine guns, turning them into devastating weapons capable of delivering concentrated firepower against enemy targets. Their primary role was to obliterate anti-aircraft defenses, a prelude to the main attack, before deploying bombs at close range. Such aircraft became terrifyingly effective in penetrating defenses and inflicting severe damage, often decimating entrenched enemy positions with precision and ferocity. Despite the fierce battles and the relentless adversities faced by Allied and Japanese forces alike, not all those who survived the deadly encounters met their end in the water or on the battlefield. Many small groups of survivors managed to reach various isolated islands scattered throughout the Pacific, each beginning desperate and often harrowing struggles for survival. These stranded individuals faced extreme hardship, lacking supplies, shelter, or medical aid, as they clung to life amid the vast, unforgiving ocean and hostile terrain. One notable incident involved a group of 18 survivors who managed to land on the island of Kirwina, only to be swiftly captured by the patrol boat PT-114. Others succeeded in navigating their way to Guadalcanal, yet their plight ended tragically when they were killed by a routine American patrol. Meanwhile, on Goodenough Island, the Australian military conducted patrols that encountered Japanese survivors in the aftermath of shipwrecks. Between the 8th and 14th of March in the year 1943, Australian forces from the 47th Infantry Battalion discovered and engaged Japanese personnel on the island. In this encounter, they killed 72 Japanese soldiers, captured 42 prisoners, and recovered the bodies of 9 Japanese men found on a raft nearby. It was only after the war concluded that the Japanese forces understood the full extent of their strategic miscalculations. Unbeknownst to them during the operation, Allied intelligence had been monitoring their movements closely. Naval codebreakers based in Melbourne, Australia, and in Washington, D.C., had intercepted, decrypted, and translated critical communications, revealing detailed information about the convoy's planned route, destination, and scheduled arrival. Every aspect of the Japanese operation, from formation and route to timing and composition, had been meticulously known to the Allies well in advance. Their confidence in the invincibility of their codes had been a grave misconception. Instead, the Allies had orchestrated a carefully prepared trap, exploiting the Japanese lack of awareness. This revelation hit the Japanese military hard, especially considering their strict Bushido code, which elevated honor, dignity, and respect in combat, and demanded a sense of moral superiority and stoicism, even in defeat. The mass killing of helpless sailors and soldiers in open water starkly contradicted these principles, creating a profound crisis within the Japanese military ethos. The massacre at Bismarck Sea, where hundreds of Japanese were systematically slaughtered, was viewed as a fundamental breach of their values, causing deep internal turmoil and disillusionment. For the survivors who returned to Rabaul, the westernmost island in the Solomon Islands, the experience left indelible scars. Many had witnessed American forces executing ruthlessly efficient attacks that directly contradicted the propaganda about American weakness and mercy. The images of aircraft systematically hunting down men floating helplessly in the water, machine guns blazing as they targeted unarmed sailors, haunted them long after the war. These horrifying sights profoundly altered their perception of victory and defeat. Many Japanese survivors reported a complete erosion of their faith in the notion of inevitable victory. If their enemies could so mercilessly machine gun helpless men and women in the water, what limits remained on American brutality? This bleak realization deeply affected Japanese resolve, leading many to decide that fighting to the death was preferable to surrendering, viewing capture as a guaranteed execution. Consequently, the strafing of shipwreck survivors remains a subject of intense debate and controversy to this day. International law, as it stood at the time, stipulated that shipwrecked sailors and other helpless individuals of the pivotal moments that reshaped the very nature of warfare in the Pacific theater. Spanning a distance of approximately 15 miles from land, this crucial stretch of sea became a battleground where the lines between conventional combat and technological dominance blurred, demonstrating how advancements in air power and intelligence could decisively influence the outcome of naval engagements. The devastating outcome of the Bismarck Sea disaster compelled the Japanese military leadership to undertake a complete and profound reassessment of their strategic approach in the region. Admiral Minichi Koga, who succeeded the legendary Admiral Yamamoto as the chief commander, quickly recognized that surface ships, even the most heavily armed and well-protected, could no longer hope to survive in waters that were increasingly under the shadow of enemy aircraft. As a result, the Japanese effectively abandoned the island of New Guinea, perceiving its defenses as indefensible against the relentless and technologically sophisticated assaults delivered from the air. The psychological toll of this defeat rippled ominously through the ranks of the Japanese forces. Troops and transport units, already vulnerable, began experiencing unprecedented rates of desertion as the prospects of being intercepted and destroyed at sea by American aircraft became a source of terror significantly greater than the fear of combat itself. The very idea of being caught helplessly at sea with no means of escape instilled a deep-seated dread among Japanese sailors and soldiers, fundamentally altering their willingness to engage in sea transport and reinforcing the perception that traditional naval confrontation was no longer viable. For the United States, the battle served as a stark confirmation that air power, when wielded effectively, had the capacity to singularly dominate and defeat naval forces. Properly equipped and well-trained land-based aircraft proved capable of securing vital sea lanes without the need for aircraft carriers, fundamentally transforming naval warfare. This realization fundamentally influenced the strategic planning for the remainder of the Pacific campaign, emphasizing the importance of air superiority and technological innovation over traditional surface fleet engagements. In the aftermath of the conflict, a quiet debate emerged concerning the morality of the strafing tactics used during the battle. Some questioned whether such actions constituted war crimes. However, no formal prosecutions ensued. The official American stance maintained that those targeted were enemy combatants who could have reached shorelines and continued fighting, which provided a legal and moral justification for the tactics employed. The decision not to prosecute reflected a broader perspective, akin to Victor's concept of justice, highlighting that both sides had crossed moral boundaries during the brutal conduct of the Pacific War. While Japanese officers faced execution for similar acts, the victorious United States chose to overlook certain wartime excesses, setting a legacy where the victors rarely faced consequences for their actions. Historians widely recognize the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a watershed moment in the evolution of aerial warfare. The raw statistics of the engagement underscore its significance. All 8 Japanese transports were sunk, 4 destroyers were destroyed, approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers lost their lives, and in stark contrast, only 13 Allied airmen were casualties. Yet beyond these numbers, the battle signified a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare itself. It was a vivid illustration of how technological and intelligence advancements had led to casualty ratios that bordered on massacres, with aircraft systematically strafing helpless crews in a brutal display of modern combat's merciless power. This ruthless efficiency was famously encapsulated in General Douglas MacArthur's description of the engagement, where he deemed it the decisive aerial confrontation of the entire Southwest Pacific campaign. His judgment proved accurate. Japan's strategic initiative in New Guinea was effectively irreversible following this battle. The demonstration that modern conflict had transcended traditional notions of armed engagement marked a turning point, illustrating that air power, when combined with intelligence and technological innovation, could lead to annihilation rather than mere victory. For Japan, the outcome signaled the beginning of a strategic decline in the Southwest Pacific. As their forces became increasingly isolated and cut off from reinforcement or supplies, both impossible within the reach of Allied air power, they faced inevitable destruction. Conversely, for the United States, the battle epitomized their transformation from victims of surprise attacks such as Pearl Harbor into a highly efficient war machine capable of systematically dismantling enemy forces on an unprecedented scale. This shift in American military capability and attitude encapsulated the profound moral and strategic evolution wrought by the Pacific War. The same nation that had been stunned by the shock of attack had, through relentless effort and technological mastery, become capable of methodically and ruthlessly destroying thousands of enemies, often with little regard for the moral ambiguities involved. The controversy surrounding the strafing of survivors reveals the complex moral landscape of war, where military necessity and humanitarian considerations frequently collided. In the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea, both sides learned that in total war, traditional humanitarian limits could be repeatedly and deliberately disregarded in pursuit of victory. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea thus stands as a stark testament to this brutal reality, a defining moment that demonstrated how warfare had fundamentally changed, emphasizing the devastating power of air supremacy and the moral compromises it entails. Among the most pivotal and fiercely debated episodes of World War II, one stands out not only due to its tactical significance, but also because of its enduring psychological and moral repercussions. Over the course of just 3 days, the combined air forces of the United States and Australia launched a relentless assault that resulted in the destruction of an entire Japanese convoy operating in the waters of the Bismarck Sea. This devastating campaign, characterized by precision strikes and overwhelming force, effectively shattered any remaining hopes the Japanese might have had of reinforcing their positions in New Guinea by sea. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers lost their lives, and the entire convoy was rendered inert, its hope for resupply and reinforcement crushed in a matter of days. The aftermath of this assault left a deep psychological scar on the surviving Japanese sailors, many of whom witnessed one of the most harrowing scenes of the Pacific War. As they watched American aircraft violently strafing helpless men who had sought refuge in the water, they were subjected to a spectacle that would haunt their memories forever. These survivors carried with them wounds that extended far beyond physical injury. They were psychologically scarred by the brutality of what they had witnessed. The images of helpless men caught in the relentless machine gun fire from the skies, unable to escape or defend themselves, shattered any illusions they had held about the nature of their enemies. It challenged and ultimately overturned their assumptions about American weakness or mercy, revealing a new and horrifying reality about the ruthlessness with which their adversaries would wage war. The significance of this battle extends well beyond the immediate tactical victory it secured. It served as a stark demonstration of the incredible power that aircraft could wield over sea lanes, establishing air supremacy as a decisive element of naval strategy in the modern battlefield. Furthermore, it underscored the importance of intelligence and technological advantage in shaping the outcomes of complex military campaigns. Yet, it also illuminated the moral ambiguities intertwined with total war, a conflict where the lines between combatant and non-combatant blurred, and the brutality of the fighting left lasting impressions. Perhaps most troubling of all is the iconic and disturbing image that emerged from this campaign. Aircraft systematically attacking and killing survivors in the water, a scene that has become one of the most contentious and haunting episodes of the Pacific War. In the end, around 3,000 Japanese personnel perished not in traditional, glorious combat, but in a calculated, methodical slaughter that symbolized the ferocity and brutality of the conflict. The survivors, traumatized and shaken, carried away stories of American ruthlessness that would influence Japanese military morale and psychological resilience for the remainder of the war. This battle fundamentally proved that in the context of modern warfare, technological superiority could translate directly into total destruction. The Japanese, witnessing these relentless acts of air power and the willingness of their enemies to kill without mercy, were profoundly shocked. They realized that their adversaries had evolved into something far more terrifying than propaganda or previous notions had suggested, an enemy capable of executing annihilation with systematic precision. This brutal lesson was learned in the blood-soaked days of March in 1843, and it would resonate deeply, shaping the increasingly savage nature of the Pacific War until its catastrophic conclusion with the advent of atomic weapons. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea thus stands not only as a military victory, but also as a stark reminder of the devastating potency of technological superiority and the profound moral costs that accompany such destructive might in the modern era of warfare.